Greetings! Over this past semester, we have been analyzing the various stages of the Byzantine Empire as it has related to the people and places around them, as it has grown and shrunk, and of course how it has interacted both politically and economically with the other nations around it, especially as it grows some of the major trade federations that interact with it, such as the Genoese, the Venetians in Venice, and the Catalans through the exploits of the Catalan Company. Today, we're going to be focusing on those who had been enslaved outside the empire and inside the empire a little bit into the 14th century, 13th and 14th century. As they are traded to gain further economic and political influence by these traders and the Byzantines under which they worked or worked with, as well as focusing a bit on what the social hierarchy of the Byzantine Empire was. We've discussed that a little bit with the beginnings under Justinian and a little bit under Michael I in the 11th century. But here we go. So now, as we're organizing our Byzantine Empire into a little bit more organized and integrated sort of bureaucracy, you see, we saw a massive shrink of political influence and, of course, just borders throughout the existence of this Byzantine Empire. So we've already looked at a bit of, let me pull up my laser pointer, a bit of what was lost early on after Justinian in the 6th century, but then of course with the expansion under our various Basils, Basil I and Basil II, as they sort of expand a bit further into Bulgaria and Hungary, and definitely more into Asia Minor, and movement over to Trebizond. And now we're into the 13th and 14th centuries, where we don't have nearly as much of a empire, but we do still have a significant amount of influence. So in 1360, all that is really left to the Paleologian dynasty is this little bit over here in Macedonia, a little bit in here in Thessalonica, a bit over here in southern Greece near Athens. But we are constantly remembering that the Byzantines were more focused inwards on themselves and creating powerful defenses by manipulating their various allies and allegiances. So now we are into the main question of this class. What is a Byzantine? What could be a Byzantine? Who was the Byzantines? And of course, who were the Byzantines? What were they doing? Of course, as far as slavery, we're going to be answering hopefully towards the end of the class. But the difference between political loyalty and ethnoculture is really where we see these lines being drawn. Lines that, of course, develop into a social hierarchy. The Byzantine Empire as a whole was not Roman, and it was not Greek. The term that was used was Romaioi, which of course is Roman in Greek. It was both and together. They did not allow for the Romani or the Grecoi. The Romani and the Grecoi were together in the Romaios, and it is with these ethnocultural terms that we really develop this loyalty. And it wasn't nearly as much a loyalty to a singular flag. It wasn't nearly that cut and dried. It was definitely more ethnocultural, and we're going to see that, of course, through the religion, that they're able to reinforce these loyalties, reinforcing the loyalties to the Byzantine Empire through the Orthodox Church. And this is, of course, is what starts our schism, Great Schism between the Eastern and the Western Church. However, even the Eastern and Western Church delineation was still not enough to allow this social hierarchy to create further differences between who could be enslaved and who could not be enslaved. The ownership of an enslaved person was not something that was really tied to that political loyalty of the Byzantine Empire. It wasn't somebody underneath that geopolitical sphere. It was much more ethno-cultural. So we had the Romani and we had the Grekoi together as the Romaioi, but this is excluding primarily the Slavs and Slavic peoples, even though we saw that they were under the geopolitical influence of the Byzantine Empire. And that social hierarchy is what I'm going to be hitting on primarily today throughout this class, where these people would sit throughout the social hierarchy as the Byzantine Empire has now shrunk down to a much smaller sphere of influence. Where do these people become? Where do they sit after, of course, being enslaved by outside sources that are used by the Byzantines to define themselves and define other people? And it is in this self-identity that we see service, service both to our political emperor and, of course, service in a separate realm, the realm of the enslaved person, service to your master. And what does it really look like to be in service to the empire or to the emperor? Was very different than, of course, what it looked like to be in service to the master. Service to the master, of course, going so far as to fight that master's battles for them in order to prevent the master from any social repercussions. But service to the empire and emperor could be something a little bit different, and was definitely more rooted in the cultural loyalty than it was necessarily to that political culture. And we see that with the Byzantines as they utilize outside forces to really provide service to that emperor. Outside services who were, again, outside of that ethno-culture of Byzantium. And of course, we have a nice meme here for you all. Now here is a nice map of Byzantium in the 13th century, but the people who would have been enslaved, the people outside the empire, let me pull up my handy laser pointer again. So the people outside the empire would have been moved toward economic centers of power. And I thought this map was very handy in illustrating that. Now, again, who was it who was enslaving these people? It was usually the traders outside of the Byzantine Empire. So our friends over here in Venice, the Genoans, who then would have just or would have been in the process of conquering Crete and Cyprus. And then, of course, the Catalans, who had a base in Crete, and, of course, ended up suffering betrayal by the Byzantines. So the Byzantines betrayed the Catalan company by assassinating one of their primary generals, Roger de Fleur. And the Catalans respond by basically just pillaging everything, all of the Byzantine interests, not necessarily the Byzantine Empire, because they couldn't really stand against the whole empire, but they ravaged a lot of Athens, and that's why you don't see that marker there. And they definitely go all the way up the Neretva River into Bulgaria, and searching for those outside of the established religion, Christianity, and they are used to be enslaved, and they gain a large amount of money from that. And of course, we know that they gained much of that influence through the existence of foreigner hordes. So there are large amounts of coins in places like Corinth and Cyprus and Crete, all with various exchanges. So they were been selling up and down the Syro-Palestinian coast over towards the Mamluks would have been a primary buyer of these new slaves that were created by the Catalans specifically. And again, as you can see here through this wonderfully done meme, that as the Byzantines, of course, really grow smaller in their political sphere, they're giving immense economic power to these trade unions, and trade federations outside them, because they are so invested in who could be Byzantine and who is not Byzantine, and establishing their own identity by those outside of that political sphere. So, unfortunately, the slave trade was a very lucrative enterprise that gained a lot of people a lot of money. And we see changes in the legality in a lot of places that these traders would have affected. For example, the legal statutes of the Shkodra, or the Scutari, as the Genoese, I believe Genoese/Florentines would have called them, are used to establish this ethnoculture and identity. They, of course, are not allowed to be Byzantine, but then what are they? Here, it started off in Germany, was the example given that the legal term for an enslaved person was sklavos, but when the Florentines and Genoese make it all the way over to Dubrovnik, or they called it Ragusa, nowadays it's called Dubrovnik in Albania, they start calling the enslaved people Slav. But the Albanians have a word Slav already, and they used Slav to refer to lord or master. And here with that legal statute, this is the example of the seal that they would use between the Albanians and the Italians. They rename, they come to a delineation and rename to Servus/Ankila, which is what they decide to use henceforth, as they are then selling these Albanians into various levels of enslavement throughout the Mediterranean. So the creation of these slaves was not really a foundational issue, but it was something that had been remarked upon by the various religious institutions. They were not allowed to enslave, per se, other Christians. So Christians could not enslave other Christians, and Muslims should not enslave other Muslims. Jews should not enslave other Jews. But it was not really of a foundational issue throughout the Balkans, because there are several examples of the Florentine traders working with clergy members who were requesting slaves. And the clergy members were more interested that the prospective female slaves would not be too young. They were requesting older female slaves, and the Florentines just told them that it was a little bit harder to come by. They weren't at all interested in the potential Christianity of those particular slaves. The reason why the Christians were okay, and of course the Muslims were okay with this, and the Jews were okay with this, is because it won souls for their respective religion, it counted as numbers for their respective religion, because it was assumed if a pagan person was enslaved by a brave Florentine or Genoese or Catalan adventurer and transported to a civilized Christian area, they would be forced into a baptism, and that means more Christians. However, in the case of Ragusa, nowadays Dubrovnik, in that case, many of these people had just dealt with the Mongolian civil wars and Mongolian raids from the winners of those wars, and they were devastated economically, and they were not unusually poor or unusually war-torn compared to other European nations at the time. They just didn't have any other options available to them, and that came in with this concept. It wasn't a new concept of debt slavery. So there are a lot of reported incidences of great migrations to Ragusa, Dubrovnik, of people buying slaves from that area because they had been selling their various family members into slavery to make money, just to survive and hopefully give their family members a better chance of surviving, hopefully being sent away to other parts of the Mediterranean where they were more likely to be taken care of. And the Christian merchants who were just traveling into Bulgaria, the Christian Catalan merchants traveling into the Balkans, they just found willing members to sell themselves into this debt slavery because there was nothing else that they could have used. And of course, the best instance would have been maybe Mamluk slavery, but very many of them were sent over to Spain or to France or to Italy or to other reaches in the Byzantine Empire, sometimes over to the Mongols, but that didn't happen as much. But this brings back our point of social hierarchy of who could be enslaved. Anybody outside of the established Christian religion was fair game for any Christian slaver. Anybody outside the established Muslim religion was perfectly okay for any Muslim trader, which happened a lot over in Spain near Valencia and into the Balearic Islands. That was a prominent feature. And lastly, the Black Death affected many of these people in southeastern Europe. That was the other major contributing factor into who could be or who needed to be sold into this debt slavery, as many families were, of course, wiped out and had nothing else to use to sustain their existence. So, in talking about different types of slavery that existed throughout the Mediterranean, we briefly touched on the Muslim response as well as the existence of Mamluk slaves. Way down here, let me click on my laser pointer. Way down here in Cairo in Egypt is where the Mamluk Sultanate was, and that is where it seems, based off of a lot of these foreigner hordes of coins, that a lot of the Catalan merchants were moving most of these male Balkan slaves to. Now, we have it listed here as the Kipchak war slaves. So these would be the people who were suffering from the various Timurid civil wars, who would have been displaced by the various Mongol civil wars, and then, of course, stolen and sold into lives of slavery, but out in Mamluk Egypt. However, this would have been a much greater agency for these people to work with. remember we talked a little bit about agency as people like what they could do within their various positions. So here in Mamluk Sultanate Egypt, these war slaves would have been forced into the military, taught how to fight, and then manumitted into the military, and then of course used against the Mongols by the Mamluks. Again, this was another form of winning the slave's soul. So again, we got to check off our identity list. Are they Muslim? No. Are they Christian? No. So they can be enslaved by Catalans and they can be sold to the Muslim Mamluk Sultanate. So we got those checked off. And then, are they able to do anything themselves, a little bit outside the interest of the ruling body, the master's body? So that would be the Mamluks. And yes, actually, so they'd be manumitted, they'd be freed into the military, and they were, of course, used to take lands and positions. And as Mamluks, they could rise through the Mamluk ranks and even take or gain the Sultanate themselves, even as far as that. But this is an interesting addition for this particular section. We're using this as a religiosity section because we want to see what it looks like for the identities of these slaves. How do they view themselves as slaves and then as manumitted professionals within that same society? And that's the primary reason for examining this Mamluk Sultanate briefly here in this particular day. Next week, we will be focusing on the Mamluk Sultanate as a whole and dive a little bit deeper into that. And here we have a nice meme about identity as it was seen by the merchants outside the Byzantine Empire, and then, of course, how it sort of was a flip reversal of identity in people. So, in talking about the interactions between art and religion, we see a little bit more agency and development with these particular slaves who would have been sold primarily, male slaves sold primarily down to the Mamluk Sultanate, but a lot of the other male slaves could have been sent as far as Spain and Italy, and we know that in Valencia, 40% of the buyers of some of these Balkan slaves were artisans, and it was very common for these artisans to share the same slave between them. So multiple artisans would go in on purchasing a singular assistant, and that would, of course, allow that person more influence as well as exposure to different types of work. Now, how much work they would have been exposed to definitely would have varied. This is more to prove that it was a real thing at the time, that they were often sent across multiple types of artisans as assistants and assisting in various types of ways. Along with that, the Mamluks also and the Italians would use some of these Balkan slaves as official business representatives of their master, and that would allow them some agency as well. They were not solely thought of as blind tools, a little bit unfortunately. They could have influenced some of these trade deals as not really business partners, but people working underneath a business master. And then, of course, we do have some experience in Valencia of official documentation relating to the damage to some of this property that, of course, these people would would be. So if a Balkan person was injured as an enslaved person in Valencia, it was up to the government to pay back the master. But there were forms of manumission as well, from that artisanal area. So, meaning that if the slave worked for an artist well or long enough upon the master's death, it was not uncommon that the master would give the enslaved person their freedom as well as the tools to continue their trade. Continuing their trade, of course, being important as it would then create a wider Mediterranean populace of manumitted Balkan professionals. And it is with this sort of model of Balkan professionalized manumission / freedom that we use to sort of see different types of artistic representations as evidence of the social hierarchy that was at hand. So that there could be, say, clerics on top, and then government rulers, and then maybe artisans, but maybe below them were recently manumitted artisans, and then of course slaves being at the bottom. But that would be an example of what we're trying to look for, and where we can try and see some of this evidence and multicultural influence in some of the art. So I have said a couple times this word agency. What, of course, is agency? Agency meaning the ability that a person who was enslaved had to affect the surroundings around them, and affect it in a way based off of their own previous personal experiences or existing cultures. So if a Armenian person was displaced by the Mongol civil wars, and they were taken into enslavement by the Catalan merchants, for example, and they were sent all the way over to Valencia, can we see then any sort of Armenian artistic cultural thing there? And if we can, that may then have been because that person who had been enslaved was then manumitted upon the death of their master and able to work as a free artisan. So what we're trying to figure out here is, did these Balkan people have agency in the Byzantine Empire? Does it count as agency before enslavement or after? And we're going to try and figure that out here with our friend Agent Phil Coulson from Marvel. So keep your eyes out for him. He'll be showing up in all the other slides in reference to agency that was had. And now is in regard to the other cultures in and around the Byzantine Empire who would have had existing cultural origin and have an established identity before being enslaved, and that enslavement then causing them to have forced assimilation into another culture, or perhaps even an acculturation. There were many different types of communities around the Byzantine Empire. For one example, the Mongols, who were a very powerful force, helped demonstrate that social hierarchy. So let's go back real quick to our social hierarchy, right? The Romani and the Grekoi, Romaoi, Slavs are out. But some people could be bought in to the Byzantine dynasty, or Byzantine Empire, through the Paleologian dynasty, as was the case with the the Mongols, and they're the son of the Ilkhan, whose name was Abaga, nailed it, And that, again, would allow them that social hierarchy of lordship. And as they would have bought in, they would have received art. Now, this was a specific type of artwork called gift artwork. And what we're trying to look for more is religious artwork. So it would have been really nice to find a Mongol example of artwork based off of religion and then see that artworking style back in the Byzantine Empire. Unfortunately, we don't have that type of source, but we can go into some sort of tangential period in looking for maybe not a Mongol artistic source, but a Mongol inspired or Mongol moved source of artwork. So, in talking about Mongol inspired or moved artwork, we're going to focus here on Armenia. Armenia here being a really interesting example because the Armenian language was something that was considered a sacred language as it was developed in the 6th century. And it very often was used instead of any sort of sacred imagery. So it was a language very closely tied to the development of the church. However, here we see the Armenian language sort of set in a ribbon around a sacred image. And then this back sort of paneling is something that is called a selvage. And it's a selvage of fleur-de-lises and pomegranates. And that particular style there, the selvage with the sort of bannering, is something that is not traditional to the Armenian Orthodox Church, but more traditional to the Islamic world and the Islamic churches or mosques that were developed around the time. And the tie here is that this Islamic style was moved through the Mongol Empire and affected the existing Armenian Orthodox churches. And we can see that as it influences then further Byzantine style. So Byzantine style would then be influenced by both the Armenian and the Islamic architectural / artistic stylings on their churches. So this Mongol transference is of course important to note because the Mongols then attacked Kaffa, which was a city that was controlled by the Genoese, because the Genoese had previously had no problem enslaving all the peoples in and around the Black Sea, but the Mongols were not okay with the Genoese enslaving Mongol citizens or people who were under the Mongol aegis of rule, and they continued to pose a threat to the Genoese interests throughout the rest of the century. So then the people who would have been transferred by these various traders, like the Venetians, the Florentines, the Genoese, the Catalans, would have been transferred to places called cultural centers. And we're going to use something here called the central place theory, which is this whole mess down here. And it basically tries to break up different parts of the medieval economy into higher order centers and lower order centers. Higher order centers being places like public transportation or government points, and lower order centers being like religious institutions, and uses that central place theory with both high and low order centers to be a sort of cultural hub from which these enslaved people would then be moved to and then had access to a much broader spectrum of artistic learning or developmental learning. The result then becomes a massive multicultural growth in all of the cities that these people would then, of course, be moved to, because, of course, they're learning and working and influencing even as they are still enslaved people. So we have our friend Agent Phil Coulson over here to be utilized to show that this is where they would have gained most of their agency. Now, moving a little bit away from this whole mess to disguise cultural place theory, we move more toward trade maps that are a lot easier to understand and read to find out where these people would, of course, would have been going. Now, development of these church artworks is an interesting thing to start focusing upon because, of course, if they were in cultural centers like, say, Cyprus, they would have had a massive multicultural influence from all sorts of different cultures. Cyprus, of course, being really interesting as it had just been conquered in the 13th century by the Genoese. And this example of the Genoese patronizing the development of an Armenian church and using different styles of painters is a very exciting place to sort of reveal the agency that potentially an artisan might have had. So we look at the images up here. Unfortunately, these are a little bit smoke covered, but we look at the images there and try and figure out what style it is. The analysis done here by our own Dr. Andrews at UNM said that it was not Byzantine, it was more of a Syro-Palestinian artistic style. So we could then see a person coming from the Syro-Palestinian coast and moving and working here in Cyprus under the assistance / patronage of the Genoese for an Armenian community that was there in Cyprus. But then that shows that the Armenian Empire was not in a very good place with any of its neighbors, either the Mongols, who were attacking and displacing most of its community, or the Byzantines, who were in turn selling and trading and profiting off of that trade of Armenian slaves. So then the grand culmination of all these cultures sort of living and working together is best evidenced through all these various artworks found in churches. But the biggest one, of course, is right here with the Hagia Sophia, as it replaced Constantinople to Trebizond, the move of the Byzantines from Constantinople to Trebizond, because the context, the Mongols had just invaded Anatolia, and they needed a place to live and work, and have that constant cultural display, that constant cult of the power and primacy of the empire and the emperor on display for the whole rest of the world to see as a political and economic defense at the same time. And that was, of course, done through art. And, of course, this massive displacement of large amounts of people due to the Mongolian civil wars was just a further testament as to not just who could find work within the empire, but also whose work could be most easily seen within the empire. Not just high-level craftsmen, but also the assistants and likely enslaved people that worked with them to create this artwork. So then, of course, who could work in all of these various churches? Not just the Hagia Sophia, but also some of the other Byzantine churches that we see throughout maybe Greece or near Thessalonica, and in and around southern Greece near Athens. There is an example of a church where 3 bodies had been found buried in the narthex, where all of these skeletons showed pretty obvious signs of lifelong labor. And this is sort of an odd thing, as it was not very common that people would be buried, only important people would be buried inside churches. But here we see an example of several, two men and a woman, buried inside the narthex of a church with pretty much looking like common laborers. And we're going to be going back to what is this social hierarchy then, who could be allowed to work in these churches, as we see further artworks of who is being punished. We have a pretty generic Florentine example of artwork of punishing sinners. And this is just a general idea of what it would sort of look like to be punished inside these churches. What is the artwork that we're looking for? What is the type of people that we're looking for? We're searching for workers in churches being punished. And how does the artist represent that? Especially if that artist is not a manumitted person, but an existing professional. So in this example, you're going to have to bear with me a little bit, which is why I showed you the specific example that we're looking for with punishment. Here we're looking at a sort of a difficult picture in which the artist is depicting those who are working, laborers, as being sinful, and of course being punished, looked down upon by the saints. Here we have a servile person looking sort of silly, sort of stupid. And what does this really mean in the context of art in these churches? If we go back previous and keep our assumption and our research straight with who these professionals could be, either existing Romaioi, or they could be freshly manumitted or relatively manumitted Balkan and enslaved people, or previously enslaved people. And if these Balkan slaves were laboring in the church, as we had seen evidenced with the example by Gestel with laborers being buried in the church, the artist might have been taking a little bit too much pleasure in developing this particular artwork in the sins of laborers. That's what this is all about. This is about the Last Judgment, specifically detailing the sins of laborers and showing the derision and looking down upon by the saints of these sort of silly-looking figures that have been created. And if this artist was a professional, of course, he would have been likely upset by the nature of an encroaching populace of other professionals. And now we're going to go back to what we had previously discussed, sort of tying all of this together a little bit more. What were the existing religions of the Balkans? We have to go back and remember the schism in 1054 with the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, between Roman Catholic and Roman Orthodox. We have Georgian Orthodox churches being available for, I guess, reappropriation by these Latin Christians, but Latin Christians could not enslave other Latin Christians, and we have this sort of dichotomy between the Latin Christendom versus the Eastern Christendom as far as who could be enslaved, and then, of course, where their influences would then end up. This, of course, noting that the preeminent Georgian Orthodox Church would then be co-opted, those artisans would be co-opted, not a century later, by the Mongolian civil wars to be distributed all across the rest of the Mediterranean. But their artwork is still in Georgia and, of course, in the Hagia Sophia, which is what we'll be looking at right now. And here, of course, going back into that big example of all of the multiculturalism in the Hagia Sophia, we have plaque roundels right here on the Hagia Sophia, and over here in Georgia and Tekemlavani in the mid-13th century, we have very similar looking carved roundels that, of course, Michael I would have likely used Georgian and Armenian craftsmen in the 12th and 13th century in developing this Hagia Sophia. But these could well have been the same people and the same influenced people who would then be displaced by the coming Mongol civil wars just 80 or 100 years later, just after this is developed. And here again, end of the 13th century, we're getting even closer to these coming Mongolian civil wars. Actually, they might even be happening right here in the Armenian carved roundel of 1281. So you have the roundel right down here, and then the sort of flanged cross right here, and then of course the floral plaque right here on the Hagia Sophia. It looks very similar to the roundel done over here in Armenia. And right up here, right up above it, you can see sort of the hinting of a very similar stylized cross that the Armenian church would have taken and drawn and been allowed to really provide their own agency for in Michael I's Hagia Sophia. So, in conclusion, did these Balkan people really have any ability after they were stolen from their homelands and sold all across the Mediterranean? Did they have any agency? Did they have any way to affect their surroundings? Did they have any outside or previous cultural knowledge? My argument, of course, is yes, very obviously, and we can see that in the art and architecture. But I think more than that, we can use this as a bit of a baseline to research more and find more as far as the multicultural elements that have been found throughout the Mediterranean, and start assigning some of those multicultural elements back to those people who would have been enslaved. Now, is this really a real method of winning souls? Is slavery a true method of winning souls? I'm not so sure. While it was argued, yes, it was not uncommon at all for various Christians to enslave Christians or Muslims who had just become Christians. That was a common practice in Spain. Similarly, in Mamluk Egypt, it was not uncommon to enslave maybe other Muslim influenced Mongolians. That was not a hard or fast rule. But we do have this large question of politics, ethnics, and spirituality being fought throughout the Byzantine Empire as the Byzantines seek to identify themselves by who they are as Romaoi and who they are not. And